Hey class, welcome back to our history subject, and we're diving back into our American Revolution book. We'll be covering chapter 13, Preparing for War, in this video. We're also going to review what we've read so far in the last chapter, chapter 12. If you haven't watched chapters 1 through 12, please go back and watch those because each chapter builds upon the other. Last chapter, we talked about Patrick Henry and his famous speech. What was his famous phrase that he said? That's right. He said, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? And that was a very persuasive speech that was getting people to unify and want to fight for the freedom. And we also read about the Paul Revere's ride and how the British were coming by water. And so on Old North Church, there was 2 lanterns that were shown to show that the British were coming by water. We read about some of the fights and how they were able to take out about half of the British soldiers on their way back from Lexington, but also some of the colonists, the Minutemen, were also injured. And then we left off at the end of chapter 12 talking about how this was actually the beginning of the War for Independence. So now we're going to get into chapter 13. Some of our primary focus objectives are to understand the main events of the Second Continental Congress, understand the course and the outcome of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and then, as always, understand our core vocabulary words. And remember to use the definitions from the book so that I know that you're getting into the book. And then when you're answering the big question, please do not copy and paste an answer. Please use your own words. I will cover some hints and some points to help you with answering that. All right, so let's call attention to the big question. Why was George Washington chosen to be the leader of the Continental Army? So as we read, let's look for answers and reasons why George Washington was the person that was chosen to be the leader of the Continental Army. Chapter 13, Preparing for War. May 10th, 1775. Once again, the leading men from every American colony gathered in Philadelphia for a Continental Congress. This time, though, was different. This time there had been fighting. This time men had died. Most of the delegates to the Second Continental Congress weren't sure what to do next. They hated the thought of separating from Great Britain and their king. They did not want to separate from their mother country. Couldn't the Continental Congress try again to solve their issues with the mother country? At the same time, they could not ignore the fact that fighting had started. Shouldn't they prepare for more fighting just in case? The Second Continental Congress did both. Delegates wrote a petition to King George III. A petition, let's learn what that is. Let's read the definition together. A formal written request for change signed by several people. So they're trying to write a petition, a formal request for things to change, signed by several people. So a petition is like a request, like, hey, please stop, probably taxing us. Please, let's stop fighting. Let's try to solve this. So that was their one thing that they're going to try to prepare for, try to prepare to mend, try to keep ties with the mother country. And the second thing, they're preparing for war. They told the king they were still loyal to him. There was no talk of independence. They said they didn't want to break up the British Empire. They only asked the king to make his government change its bad policies and restore the colonists' rights. Remember, a big thing that the colonists were fighting for was taxation without representation. They did not like all these taxes that they had no say in. And so they wanted these policies, or let's learn what a policy is, the definition, an official course of action. They wanted the government to change its bad policies, right? This taxation without representation, and to restore the rights of the Englishmen. And then let's look at this cool picture and read its caption. It says, "The colonist petition is delivered to King George III." Here's King George III, and here is their petition in his hand. So at the same time, the Congress prepared for more fighting. John Adams of Massachusetts took the lead. Adams believed that the local militias were fine for fighting here and there. To fight a war, though, they needed to create a real American army, an army of the United Colonies. At the time, members of the Massachusetts militia were camped outside of Boston, near the British troops. Those militiamen, said Adams, were ready to be the first soldiers in the new army. But who would lead Adams' Army of the United Colonies? How fortunate the Congress was, Adams continued to have the right man for the job in that very room. He was a man of great talents and excellent character. He was an experienced military leader from Virginia. As Adams continued to speak, all eyes turned to the tall man dressed in an old militia uniform, standing in the back of the room. The man quickly turned and walked out. He wanted the delegates to be free to discuss him without him being present. That man was George Washington. Adams was right, and the other delegates agreed. But before we continue, let's pause and look at this cool picture of George Washington. So George Washington was chosen to lead the Continental Army. And remember, this is our big question. So as we continue to read, let's look for the reasons why George Washington was chosen. We just read a quote saying that he was a man that had great talents and an excellent character. So that's part of the reason why he was chosen. So Washington was the perfect man to lead the Continental Army, as it came to be called. He had gained his military experience in the French and Indian War. After that, he returned to Mount Vernon, Virginia, to run his plantation. He was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses and a supporter of the Patriot cause. He was also among the best known and wealthiest men in the colonies. Everyone admired him for his devotion to duty, his cool head, and strong will. So we just covered some points right there for your big question. It was settled. Washington would command the Continental Army, and its first troops would be the Massachusetts militiamen camped around Boston. They might be needed for action soon. More British soldiers were arriving in the colonies. Washington headed to Massachusetts to take charge of the militia. Before his arrival, though, the American soldiers fought an important battle near Boston. Two hills overlooked the city of Boston, Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. Every general knows that it's a great advantage to control the high ground. From the top of a hill, you can fire down at the enemy below, especially if you have cannons. Meanwhile, the enemy has to fight its way uphill. Before we continue, let's pause and look at this picture and read its caption together. On July 3rd, 1775, George Washington took command of the Continental Army. So, almost exactly a year before Independence Day, he took control of the Continental Army. The British understood this idea, but they were not very worried about the untrained Massachusetts militiamen. They did not bother to guard the two hills. On the night of June 16, 1775, the militia suddenly marched to Breed's Hill and climbed it. They were supposed to take up positions on Bunker Hill, but moved onto the wrong hill. All night, they dug trenches. All right, so a trench is a narrow ditch dug into the ground. That way they have cover. They can, lay in it. If they're getting shot, they can, kneel down or lay down for protection, right? So piling the earth walls 6 feet high for their protection. When the morning came, the British were surprised to see the colonial militia in control of the hill. General Gage was now worried that the militia would be able to fire upon his troops. Remember, General Gage is the Massachusetts governor that was sent from the British. They could even use cannons to fire upon the British ships in the harbor. Gage needed to drive the militia off the hill. Gage didn't know that the Massachusetts militia didn't have any cannons. The next day, British soldiers marched up Breed's Hill. The colonists had only a small amount of ammunition, bullets or shells, so they only had a small amount of bullets for their guns. They couldn't afford to waste any. They stood shoulder to shoulder behind their earthen walls, the walls that they had dug and built upon from the earthen walls. When the British got close, the militiamen opened fire. Hundreds of redcoats fell. Remember, redcoats was a nickname for the British soldiers because their coats were red. The rest fled back down the hill. Once more, the British marched up the hill. Once more, they were driven back by a hail of bullets. After the second charge, the colonists began to run out of ammunition. When the British marched up the hill a third time, the militia retreated. So this is a picture of Bunker Hill. Proved to be a very costly victory for the British. The British won the hill, but at a terrible cost. More than 1,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. Just as during their march back from Concord, the British lost about half their men. A British officer said that his army couldn't stand many more victories like this. Even though the battle took place on Breed's Hill, it is known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill was very important to the colonists. They lost the hill, but they won new confidence. They were beginning to believe these citizen soldiers could hold their own against the world's greatest army, the British Army. So let's pause really quick. The British officer realized that they won this battle, but they lost so many people during that time. And so that's why victories is in quotes. Yes, they won, but at what cost? And he realized that they couldn't do this very longer. Soon these victories would actually end up being defeats. Soon after, the colonists learned King George III's answer to their petition. He had no intention of backing down. Instead, he was eager to fight. Okay. So the fight is continuing. The war is about to rage on. Right, so the big question, why was George Washington chosen to be the leader of the Continental Army? So Washington was respected and well known throughout the colonies. And then he had gained what experience? He gains a certain kind of experience during what war? Okay, and there are some other key characteristics of why he was chosen. Okay, so those should be your points. Pages 84 and 85 will help you with that. And I will see you guys in our next chapter, chapter 14, The Great Declaration. You guys are awesome. Keep it up. I'll see you guys in the next one.